I watched from my kitchen window as 3 years of painstaking work died in front of me, bulldozed into oblivion by a crew that had no idea what they were destroying. My name is Preston Williams, and I had spent every spare moment since moving to Riverside Heights, Arizona, cultivating what local gardening enthusiasts called the most impressive native desert garden in the entire Phoenix metropolitan area. But on that scorching Tuesday morning in June, all I could do was sprint outside in my pajamas and watch as industrial machinery tore through my carefully planned landscape like it was nothing more than overgrown weeds. "Stop! What the hell are you doing?" I shouted over the roar of the excavator. The operator, a middle-aged man with a sun-weathered face, cut the engine and leaned out. "HOA work order, buddy. We're clearing non-compliant landscaping per Section 12.4 of your community guidelines." I felt my blood run cold. Non-compliant. I submitted my landscape design to the HOA 3 years ago. It was approved. He shrugged and pulled out a crumpled work order from his shirt pocket. "Look, I just do what they pay me to do. Says right here the property at 4738 Desert Bloom Drive needs immediate remediation. That's you, right?" Before I could respond, a white Mercedes SUV pulled up to my curb, and out stepped Susan Whitmore, the HOA president. Everything about Susan screamed middle management power trip, from her severe blonde bob to her perfectly pressed linen pantsuit despite the 100-degree heat. She had that particular expression I'd come to recognize over the past year, the one that said she was about to ruin someone's day and enjoy every second of it. "Good morning, Preston," she said with false sweetness. "I see you've met our landscaping crew. Susan, what is this?" "My garden was approved. I have the paperwork." She pulled out her tablet and tapped it with one manicured nail. "That approval was conditional upon maintaining the aesthetic standards outlined in our updated guidelines from last month. Your property has become an eyesore with all those wild plants, and that's simply unacceptable for a community of our caliber." I stared at her in disbelief. "Wild plants? Those are native desert species. I have saguaro cacti, palo verde trees, desert marigolds, brittlebush, and agave that took years to establish. Do you have any idea what you've just destroyed?" "I'm aware you've been growing weeds," Susan said dismissively. "The board voted unanimously that your yard violated our green lawn requirement." "Green lawn requirement." My voice cracked with frustration. "We live in the desert. The whole point of xeriscaping is water conservation. I've reduced my water usage by 80% compared to when I had a traditional lawn." Susan's smile didn't waver. "That's lovely for the environment, I'm sure, but it doesn't align with the premium image we're cultivating for Riverside Heights. You have 30 days to install proper sod and conventional landscaping, or you'll face daily fines of $200. I looked back at my garden, or what was left of it. The crew had already torn out my golden barrel cacti that had been thriving for decades before I'd even moved them to my property. My ocotillo plants, which had just bloomed brilliantly red that spring, were snapped like twigs. The carefully arranged rock garden that had featured rare desert specimens was now just churned earth and debris. "You can't do this," I said, though my voice lacked conviction because clearly she already had. "Read your HOA agreement, Preston. Section 12 clearly gives us the authority to maintain community standards. Have a wonderful day." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Mercedes. The excavator operator gave me an apologetic look. "Sorry, man. I've got to finish the job." I stood there feeling helpless as they continued their destruction for another hour. By the time they left, my front and side yards looked like a construction site. 3 years of work, Thousands of dollars in rare desert plants and countless hours of careful cultivation were reduced to dirt and debris. The afternoon sun beat down on the exposed earth where shade providing palo verde trees had stood that morning. I went inside and immediately started searching for the documentation. My hands shook as I rifled through my filing cabinet. I found it, the original landscape approval from 3 years ago, signed by the previous HOA president, marked as approved with no conditions or expiration date. I also found the HOA guidelines from that time, which had actually encouraged water-wise native landscaping. Then, I pulled up the HOA website and downloaded the new guidelines Susan had referenced. They'd been updated just 6 weeks ago, and buried in the dense legal language was a new requirement that all front-facing yards maintain a minimum of 70% traditional turf grass coverage. The change had been announced in a single email I'd apparently missed while traveling for work. My phone rang. It was my neighbor Marcus from 3 houses down. "Preston, I just got home and saw your yard. What happened?" "Susan Whitmore happened," I said bitterly. "That woman is something else. She tried to fine me last month because my fence was the wrong shade of tan. I had to repaint the entire thing." Marcus paused. "Listen, you need to document everything. Take photos, save all your paperwork. My cousin's a lawyer and he's told me stories about HOAs that would make your head spin. If you're thinking about fighting this, you'll need evidence." He was right. I spent the rest of the afternoon photographing the destruction from every angle, creating a detailed inventory of every plant that had been destroyed, and researching their replacement value. My garden hadn't just been pretty, it had been a carefully curated collection. Some of those specimens were rare cultivars worth hundreds of dollars each. The mature saguaro alone had cost me $3,000 to properly transplant and establish. By evening, I'd calculated that the replacement value of the destroyed landscaping was approximately $47,000, not including the labor I'd invested or the 3 years of growth time. I wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, I showed up at the HOA office before they opened. The Riverside Heights HOA operated out of a small building near the community center, staffed by Susan and 2 part-time administrators. When Susan arrived at 9, I was waiting by the door with a folder full of documentation. "We need to talk," I said. She sighed dramatically. "Preston, I don't have time for complaints this morning. If you want to dispute the action, you can submit a written appeal to the board." "I'm not appealing anything. I'm informing you that what you did was illegal. You destroyed approved landscaping without proper notice and in violation of the HOA's own previous guidelines. I'm filing a lawsuit for property damage." That got her attention. Her eyes narrowed. "You signed an arbitration agreement when you bought your house. Any disputes must go through the HOA arbitration process first. Arbitration applies to disputes about rule interpretation. This is destruction of property. That's a tort claim and it falls outside the arbitration requirement." I'd spent half the night researching Arizona HOA law, and I knew I was on solid ground. Susan's jaw tightened. "You're making a mistake. The board has significant resources to fight frivolous litigation. Then I guess we'll see each other in court." I walked away before she could respond, my heart pounding. I'd never sued anyone before, never even been particularly litigious, but something about watching 3 years of careful work destroyed in an afternoon had ignited something in me. This wasn't just about the garden anymore. It was about accountability. My first stop was the law office of Rodriguez and Chen, the firm Marcus's cousin worked for. David Rodriguez greeted me in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Phoenix. "Marcus told me a little about your situation," David said after we'd shaken hands. "Walk me through exactly what happened." I spent the next hour laying out everything. The original approval, the years of maintenance, the sudden destruction, Susan's justification based on new rules, and my research into the costs. David took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "Okay, here's what I'm seeing. You have a strong case for several claims. First, the HOA's destruction of your property without proper notice violates Arizona's planned community statutes. They're required to give written notice and an opportunity to cure before taking action, especially something this drastic. Second, if your original landscape was approved, they can't retroactively revoke that approval without compensation. Third, the new rule requiring grass lawns might actually violate state water conservation laws." "Wait, what?" I leaned forward. "How?" "Arizona has pretty strict requirements about water usage in residential communities, especially in the Phoenix area. HOAs can't mandate landscaping that contradicts state water conservation efforts. Requiring grass lawns in the desert might qualify as exactly that kind of violation." David flipped through his notes. "Let me do some research, but I think we can not only sue for the damage they caused, but also challenge the validity of their new landscaping rules." "How much is this going to cost me?" "I'll be straight with you. HOA litigation can get expensive. But in cases like this where the HOA has clearly overstepped, we can often recover attorneys' fees. I'd recommend we send a demand letter first, outlining your damages and giving them a chance to settle. If they refuse, we file suit. I'll work on a contingency basis, taking a percentage of any recovery, so you won't have upfront legal costs." It felt like the first good news I'd had in 24 hours. "Let's do it." Over the next week, David drafted a comprehensive demand letter. It detailed the destruction, calculated damages at $47,000 for plant replacement, added another $20,000 for the time and labor I'd invested, and included a demand that the HOA rescind its new grass lawn requirement. The letter gave them 14 days to respond. Meanwhile, I couldn't just let my yard sit as a barren wasteland. I spent my evenings clearing debris and documenting everything for the case. Several neighbors stopped by to express their sympathy and share their own HOA horror stories. Apparently, Susan had been on a particular tier lately, fining people for minor violations like garbage cans visible from the street or Christmas lights up past January 1st. "She's been worse since the election," said Patricia, who lived directly next door. "She won by just 3 votes to become president, and I think it went to her head. The previous president was much more reasonable." On day 13, after the demand letter was sent, David called me. "They responded," he said, and I couldn't tell from his tone whether that was good or bad. "And they're offering $5,000 to cover replanting costs, with no admission of wrongdoing, and you'd have to sign a release waiving all future claims." I felt anger surge through me. 5,000. The destroyed plants alone were worth almost 50. That's insulting. "I agree. Which is why I recommend we reject their offer and file suit. They're clearly not taking this seriously." "Do it." The lawsuit was filed in Maricopa County Superior Court 3 days later. I sued both the HOA as an entity and Susan Whitmore personally for her role in ordering the destruction. The complaint included counts for property damage, violation of Arizona's planned community statutes, breach of contract, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Susan's reaction was swift and vindictive. 2 days after she was served with the lawsuit, I received a notice from the HOA that my property was in violation of the 30-day deadline to install new landscaping. Daily fines of $200 would begin immediately. I was also cited for 17 other violations. My house number wasn't centered properly on my mailbox. My trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after collection. My front door wreath was not an approved decoration, and the list went on. This is retaliation, I told David. Half of these violations are completely made up. Document everything, David advised. This actually helps our case. It shows a pattern of harassment in response to you exercising your legal rights. That's another claim we can add. But knowing it would help the lawsuit didn't make living through it any easier. Every day brought new notices taped to my door. Susan apparently drove by my house multiple times daily looking for violations. When she couldn't find real ones, she invented them. My doorbell camera caught her measuring the height of my mailbox at 7 in the morning, then writing a citation because it was apparently half an inch too tall. The daily fines accumulated quickly. After 2 weeks, the HOA claimed I owed $7,000. They sent a notice that they were placing a lien on my property. Can they do that? I asked David in a panicked phone call. They can file a lien, yes, but we're going to challenge it as part of the lawsuit. No judge is going to enforce a lien based on retaliatory fines. This is insane. I feel like I'm being stalked by my own HOA. You basically are. But Preston, I need you to hang in there. I've seen cases like this before. The HOA is overplaying their hand and it's going to backfire spectacularly. The situation escalated further when Susan organized an emergency HOA meeting to discuss what she called my flagrant disregard for community standards. The meeting was announced with just 48 hours' notice, which Marcus told me was itself a violation of the HOA's bylaws requiring a week's notice for general meetings. I attended anyway, bringing David with me. The community center meeting room was packed. Apparently, drama was good for attendance. Susan sat at a table at the front with the 4 other board members, looking like she was presiding over a trial. We're here to discuss the ongoing situation with Preston Williams at 4738 Desert Bloom Drive, Susan began, her voice carrying that self-righteous tone I'd come to hate. Mr. Williams has refused to comply with basic community standards and has now filed a frivolous lawsuit against the HOA, costing all of us money in legal fees. Point of order, David said, standing. This meeting shouldn't be happening at all. You didn't provide adequate notice as required by your bylaws. Susan waved dismissively. This is an emergency meeting under Section 19.2. An emergency meeting is for immediate threats to health, safety, or property. A landscaping dispute doesn't qualify. David remained standing. Furthermore, discussing ongoing litigation in a public meeting is inappropriate and potentially damaging to the HOA's legal position. I'd advise the board to table this discussion and consult with your attorney. We have consulted our attorney, Susan snapped. And we're well within our rights to discuss member violations. The meeting devolved from there. Susan presented a slideshow of photographs of my destroyed yard, making it look as terrible as possible, while describing my property as a blight on the community. Several board members nodded along, clearly already convinced. Then something unexpected happened. Patricia, my neighbor, stood up. I'd like to speak, she said. I live next to Preston, and I've watched his garden grow over the past 3 years. It was beautiful. It attracted hummingbirds and butterflies. It was a showcase for water conservation. What Susan ordered done to his property was vandalism, pure and simple. Miss Chen, you're out of order, Susan said. No, she's not, said another voice. Marcus stood up. The bylaws allow any member to speak at general meetings, and I agree with Patricia. What was done to Preston's property was wrong, and these retaliatory fines are even worse. More people started standing. I realized with surprise that I had more support in the community than I'd known. One by one, neighbors spoke up about their own issues with Susan's heavy-handed enforcement, about the arbitrary nature of recent fines, about how the community used to be a pleasant place to live before she'd become president. Susan's face grew redder with each speaker. Finally, she slammed her gavel on the table. "This meeting is adjourned. The board will reconvene in executive session." As people filed out, several came up to shake my hand or offer words of encouragement. An older gentleman named Frank pulled me aside. "I've been in Riverside Heights for 12 years, he said. "Served on the board for 6 of those. Susan's out of control, but she's got enough allies on the current board to keep doing whatever she wants. The annual election is in 4 months. If you can hang on until then, we might be able to vote in a new board and end this nonsense." 4 months felt like an eternity with $200 in fines piling up daily, but I thanked him for the perspective. The lawsuit moved forward through the discovery phase. David subpoenaed all HOA records related to my property, the landscape approval, and the new guidelines. What we found was damning. The new grass lawn requirement had been passed at a board meeting where only 3 of 5 board members were present, just barely making quorum. The meeting minutes showed it was added to the agenda at the last minute with no prior notice to the community. Even more interesting, the minutes revealed that one board member, Linda Foster, had voted against the measure and objected on the record that it seemed designed specifically to target my property. David also discovered that Susan had a personal interest in the landscaping company she'd hired to destroy my garden. Her brother-in-law owned the company, and the HOA had paid them $11,000 for a job that should have cost maybe $2,000. "This is fraud," David said, showing me the documents in his office. "Susan essentially used HOA funds to pay her family member an inflated price to destroy your property. We're amending the complaint to include fraud claims." "Can we report this to the police?" I asked. "Potentially, but let's get through the civil case first. If we can prove fraud in court, that makes any criminal case stronger." The amended complaint seemed to wake up the HOA's insurance company. Apparently, insurance doesn't cover fraud, and they were suddenly very interested in distancing themselves from Susan's actions. Their attorney called David to discuss settlement. "They're offering $50,000, David told me after the call. "Full restoration of your garden with plants of equivalent size and maturity, removal of all fines, and a permanent exemption from the grass requirement for your property." It was a significant offer, but something bothered me. What about Susan? Does she face any consequences? "Not in this settlement. They want a full release for all parties." "No deal," I said immediately. "This isn't just about money. Susan committed fraud with HOA funds and destroyed my property out of spite. If she walks away from this with no consequences, she'll just do it to someone else." David smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that. Let me counter with a demand that Susan be removed from the board as a condition of settlement." The insurance company balked at that. Their attorney argued they couldn't force Susan to resign. David argued that they could require it as part of the settlement or face a much larger judgment at trial, plus potential criminal referral for fraud. While this negotiation played out, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. The local news picked up the story. A reporter named Jennifer Alvarez from Channel 12 News reached out to me after seeing the lawsuit filed in the public records. She was doing a series on HOA abuses in Arizona and wanted to feature my case. I was hesitant at first. I'm not someone who seeks attention, and I worried that media coverage might complicate the lawsuit. But David thought it could help. Public pressure can be effective, he said. And everything you'd tell her is already in the public court record anyway. The news segment aired on a Friday evening. Jennifer had done her homework. She'd interviewed me, filmed the barren wasteland of my yard, talked to neighbors about Susan's reign of terror, and even gotten a water conservation expert from Arizona State University to discuss the absurdity of requiring grass lawns in the desert. The segment included footage from my doorbell camera showing Susan measuring my mailbox and writing citations. It showed the before photos of my beautiful native garden and the after photos of churned dirt. And it featured an on-camera interview where I calmly explained how the HOA had destroyed 3 years of work without proper notice. Jennifer had tried to interview Susan, but she'd refused and slammed the door in the camera crew's face. That footage made it into the segment too, making Susan look exactly as unreasonable as she was. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story went viral on social media. My phone started ringing with calls from other news outlets wanting follow-up interviews. The HOA's email and phone system apparently crashed from the volume of complaints. And most importantly, the community members of Riverside Heights started organizing. Frank, the former board member I'd met at the disastrous HOA meeting, reached out to coordinate what he called a reform slate for the upcoming board election. He'd found 5 community members willing to run on a platform of reasonable enforcement, transparent governance, and reversing Susan's most egregious rules. The news coverage was a wake-up call, Frank told me over coffee. People are realizing that what happened to you could happen to any of us. We've got real momentum for change. But Susan wasn't going down without a fight. 2 weeks after the news story aired, I came home from work to find my entire front yard had been spray painted with orange X marks. A notice on my door informed me that the HOA had declared my property a safety hazard due to exposed soil erosion risk, and they were authorizing another remediation at my expense. I immediately called David. She's going to destroy what little is left of my yard again. Take photos of everything and call the police non-emergency line. What she's doing is harassment. We need a paper trail. The police officer who responded was sympathetic but limited in what he could do. This is a civil dispute, he explained. Unless she's directly threatening you or trespassing, HOA issues aren't criminal matters. Even when she's committing fraud with community funds. That would be something to report to the Attorney General's office, but I can write up a report about the harassment for your records. It felt like every avenue led to more waiting, more documentation, more bureaucracy. I was exhausted from months of fighting, from the daily stress of wondering what Susan would do next, from the financial pressure of potential fines and legal costs. That night, sitting in my empty living room, I seriously considered just giving up. Installing a grass lawn and moving on with my life would be easier. The fight had consumed my life for months. Was it really worth it? Then I looked at the photos on my phone from before the destruction. My garden in spring with the ocotillo blooming bright red, the saguaro standing proud, the desert marigolds carpeting the ground in gold. That garden had been a labor of love, an environmental statement, and proof that you could create beauty while respecting the natural desert ecosystem. I wasn't going to let Susan Whitmore erase that. The trial date was set for September, 4 months after the initial destruction. In the weeks leading up to it, David prepared me for testimony, reviewed evidence, and lined up expert witnesses including the ASU water conservation specialist from the news segment and a landscape architect who who would testify about the value of the destroyed plants. The HOA's legal strategy became clear during depositions. They were arguing that the new grass requirement was a legitimate exercise of their rule-making authority, that I'd been given adequate notice, and that the destruction was necessary to maintain community standards. They tried to characterize my garden as neglected and overgrown rather than carefully curated. Susan's personal deposition was a disaster for their case. Under questioning from David, she became defensive and evasive. She couldn't explain why the rule had been changed so suddenly, why I hadn't been given more notice before the destruction, or why her brother-in-law's company had been paid so much for the work. When David asked directly if she'd benefited financially from hiring her relative, she refused to answer, citing her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. In a civil case, that refusal could be used against her. She basically admitted guilt, David told me after the deposition. No jury is going to miss that. But we wouldn't get to a jury trial. 2 weeks before the scheduled trial date, the HOA's insurance company made a final settlement offer. They would pay $120,000. $75,000 would go directly to me for damages, pain and suffering, and compensation for my time and effort. $45,000 would be placed in escrow specifically for restoration of my garden, with me having full control over the design and implementation. All fines would be permanently removed. The grass lawn requirement would be repealed, and Susan Whitmore would be required to resign from the board immediately and be permanently banned from serving in any HOA leadership position. Additionally, the HOA would send a formal apology letter to all community members explaining what had happened and committing to governance reforms. "What do you think?" David asked. I read through the settlement agreement carefully. It was everything I'd wanted and more. The financial compensation was significant. The restoration fund would allow me to rebuild my garden even better than before, and most importantly, Susan would face real consequences for her actions. What about the fraud? Does this mean she gets away with stealing HOA funds? Not necessarily, David said. This settlement doesn't prevent criminal prosecution. In fact, I've already been in contact with the Arizona Attorney General's office. They've opened an investigation into the HOA's finances based on the evidence we uncovered. Whether they bring charges is up to them, but our lawsuit has provided them with everything they need. That was enough for me. Let's do it. The settlement was finalized on a Tuesday morning in late August. Susan signed her resignation that same day. According to neighbors who witnessed it, she left the HOA office in tears, screaming about ungrateful community members and frivolous lawsuits. I felt no sympathy. She'd brought this entirely on herself. With the settlement funds secured, I began the process of restoring my garden. This time, I hired a professional landscape architect, Maria Gonzalez, who specialized in native desert plantings. We spent hours designing a landscape even more ambitious than my original. "We're going to make this a showcase," Maria said, sketching on her tablet. "Not just for your property, but as an example for the whole community of what sustainable desert landscaping can be." We sourced mature specimens from specialty nurseries across Arizona and New Mexico. A 20-foot saguaro that was at least 80 years old, multiple palo verde trees for shade, clusters of ocotillo, agave, and barrel cacti, desert wildflowers that would bloom throughout the year, native grasses that needed minimal water, and a sophisticated drip irrigation system that would use 70% less water than a traditional lawn. The installation took 3 weeks. I took time off work to supervise and help where I could. Neighbors stopped by constantly to watch the transformation and ask questions about the plants. Several asked for Maria's contact information because they wanted to convert their own yards. "This is exactly what I'd hoped would happen," I told Maria as we placed the final accent rocks, leading by example rather than being forced to conform. The finished garden was spectacular, even better than before because now I had the resources to do it right. The mature plants gave it an established look immediately. The design had better flow and balance, and knowing that it had been paid for by Susan's insurance company after she tried to destroy it made it even sweeter. I invited everyone who'd supported me during the fight to a garden party once everything was complete. Patricia, Marcus, Frank, and dozens of other neighbors came through to admire the transformation. Even Jennifer from Channel 12 News stopped by to film a follow-up segment about the resolution. "This is a story about standing up to abuse of power," she said during her stand-up in front of my restored garden. Preston Williams refused to accept that an HOA could destroy his property without consequences. His persistence not only restored his garden, but led to reforms that will protect all Riverside Heights residents going forward. The community member I was most grateful to see was Linda Foster, the board member who'd voted against Susan's grass requirement in the first place. She pulled me aside during the party. "I want to apologize," she said. "I should have fought harder against Susan. I knew what she was doing was wrong, but I didn't want the confrontation." "You voted against it," I said. "That's on the record. You did what you could." "Still, I'm glad this happened, if that makes sense. Not that your garden was destroyed, but that it finally exposed what Susan was doing. She'd been abusing her position for a long time. You just happened to be the one who said enough." The HOA election happened in October, right on schedule. Frank's reform slate swept the board, winning all 5 open seats. Their first official act was to repeal not just the grass requirement, but a dozen other unreasonable rules Susan had pushed through. They also commissioned an independent audit of HOA finances to determine the full extent of Susan's self-dealing. The audit revealed that the $11,000 payment to her brother-in-law for destroying my garden was just the tip of the iceberg. Over her 2 years as president, Susan had steered more than $60,000 in HOA contracts to companies owned by family members, always at inflated prices. The new board forwarded the audit to the Attorney General's office as additional evidence for their ongoing investigation. I thought the story was over at that point. I had my garden back, Susan was gone, the community was reforming, and I'd received substantial compensation. But there was one more chapter to come. In early December, 6 months after my garden was first destroyed, I received a call from a prosecutor at the Arizona Attorney General's office. Susan Whitmore was being charged with fraud, embezzlement, and theft for her misuse of HOA funds. They wanted to know if I'd be willing to testify at her trial. "Absolutely," I said without hesitation. The criminal trial took place the following March, nearly a year after the initial destruction of my garden. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the audit showing the pattern of self-dealing, the specific example of the inflated contract to destroy my garden, and testimony from multiple community members about Susan's abuse of power. I testified for 2 hours, walking the jury through everything that had happened. The prosecutor used my photos to show the before and after of my garden, making clear the destruction that had been wrought. When I described watching 3 years of work destroyed in a single morning, several jurors looked visibly upset. Susan's defense attorney tried to argue that mistakes in judgment weren't crimes, that HOA board members had broad discretion. and that there was no evidence she'd personally profited. But the prosecution countered with bank records showing that her brother-in-law had made several large cash payments to Susan after receiving HOA contracts, including $3,000 just days after the garden destruction. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing 2 months later, the judge was unsparing in his criticism. "You were given a position of trust by your community," he told Susan, who stood ashen-faced before the bench. "Rather than serve that community, you chose to enrich yourself and your family. You abused your power to punish those who dared question you. This kind of corruption in HOA governance is unfortunately too common, and it requires serious consequences." Susan was sentenced to 3 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 18 months. She was also ordered to pay restitution of $62,000 to the HOA for all the fraudulent contracts, and an additional $25,000 directly to me for the harassment and emotional distress she'd caused. As I walked out of the courthouse that day, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't fully expected. Justice had been served not just in civil court, but in criminal court. Susan Whitmore had faced real consequences for her actions. My garden thrived through that first year and into the next. The plants established themselves beautifully. The saguaro adapted well to its new location. The wildflowers bloomed in waves of color from February through October. My water bill remained minimal, but more gratifying than the garden itself was the ripple effect throughout the community. Within 2 years of my settlement, more than 40 properties in Riverside Heights had converted to native desert landscaping. The community's overall water usage dropped by 30%. The new HOA board worked cooperatively with homeowners rather than ruling by fiat. Maria Gonzalez, the landscape architect who designed my restoration, told me she'd gotten so much business from the publicity around my case that she'd been able to expand her firm and hire 2 additional designers. Native plant nurseries in the Phoenix area reported increased demand. Other HOAs in Arizona began revisiting their landscaping requirements. "You started something bigger than just your garden," Marcus told me one evening as we stood in my yard admiring the sunset light on the saguaro. "You changed how people think about desert landscaping and HOA accountability." I thought about that observation a lot in the years that followed. I'd never intended to become some kind of activist or community reformer. I just wanted to grow native plants in my yard and have them left alone. But Susan Whitmore's vindictive destruction had forced me to fight, and that fight had revealed problems that went far beyond my property. The most unexpected outcome came 3 years after the initial incident. I was contacted by an Arizona state legislator who'd followed my case closely. She was sponsoring a bill that would reform HOA governance across the state, requiring more transparency in rule changes, limiting the kinds of restrictions HOAs could place on water-wise landscaping, and creating stronger penalties for board member fraud. "Your case was the inspiration," she told me. "We've been trying to pass HOA reform for years, but we never had a clear example that showed why it was needed. Your story, with the garden destruction and Susan's prosecution, made it real for people." The bill passed and was signed into law. The Preston Williams Act, as some people jokingly called it, though that wasn't its official name, established new protections for Arizona homeowners and new accountability for HOA boards. I was invited to the signing ceremony. Standing there in the governor's office, watching the governor sign legislation that had grown out of my fight with Susan Whitmore, felt surreal. I thought back to that morning when I'd watched the excavator tear through my garden, how helpless and angry I'd felt. That anger had been channeled into something productive. By refusing to back down, by documenting everything, by hiring a good lawyer and seeing the case through, I'd not only restored my garden but created change that would protect thousands of other homeowners. 5 years after the destruction of my original garden, I hosted another party, this one celebrating the anniversary of the settlement. The garden had matured beautifully. The saguaro had grown several inches and was developing new arms. The palo verde trees provided deep shade. The seasonal flowers attracted hummingbirds, butterflies, and even the occasional roadrunner. Frank, now in his second term on the HOA board, made a toast to Preston, who taught us all that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it seems easier to give up, and to gardens that respect the desert rather than trying to fight it. Everyone raised their glasses. I looked around at the community that had supported me, at the garden that had been destroyed and reborn even stronger, at the legal and legislative changes that had resulted from one HOA president's overreach. Susan Whitmore had been released from prison after serving 20 months. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd moved out of state to somewhere in Colorado. I felt no need to know more than that. She was no longer my problem, no longer anyone's problem in Riverside Heights. The story could have ended differently. I could have accepted that first insulting $5,000 settlement offer. I could have given up under the weight of the harassment and daily fines. I could have installed a grass lawn and tried to forget the whole thing. But I hadn't, and the difference that made extended far beyond my property line. As the party continued into the evening and the desert air cooled, I stood alone for a moment by the mature saguaro that had cost $3,000 to transplant and establish, that Susan had tried to destroy, and that now stood as a testament to resilience. Native desert plants are survivors. They've adapted to harsh conditions, to extreme temperatures, to minimal water. They can't be killed easily. Maybe I'd learned something from them during those 3 years of growing my original garden. When my landscape was destroyed, I could have wilted. Instead, I'd adapted, survived, and eventually thrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia next door. "Your garden is the pride of the neighborhood. Thank you for never giving up." I smiled and texted back a simple thank you, then rejoined the party. The fight was over. The garden was restored. Justice had been served. And the community was better for all of it. In the end, Susan Whitmore had taught me something valuable, though not what she'd intended. She taught me that standing up to abuse of power, even when it's uncomfortable and expensive and time-consuming, is always worth it. Not just for yourself, but for everyone who comes after you. My garden would continue to grow and evolve over the years to come. The saguaro might eventually tower 30 feet high. The palo verde trees would spread their canopy wider. New species would establish themselves as the ecosystem matured, but it would always be more than just a garden. It would be a reminder of what happens when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, when they document their case, hire good lawyers, and see things through to the end. It would be proof that HOA boards answer to their communities, not the other way around. And every time I looked at it, I'd remember that sometimes the best response to someone trying to destroy what you've built is simply to rebuild it even better than before.